In a serene village on the West African coast, nestled between rolling hills and vast oceans, lived a peculiar man named Amadi. Raised by the village elders after being found as a baby near the sacred forest, Amadi was known for his unique ability to communicate with ancestral spirits through his collection of ancient stones. The people of the village revered Amadi as their spiritual guide, believing he could interpret the will of their ancestors and predict the future. One evening, while performing a traditional ritual with his sacred stones, Amadi had a strange vision. The spirits whispered that the long-lost son of a great European nobleman, connected to their village's heritage through history, would soon return to Africa. This heir was destined to bring balance between two worlds, the African village and a European estate, and restore harmony between two distant cultures. Determined to fulfill this prophecy, the village chief tasked Amadi with a mission to travel to Europe and find this lost son. Armed with his bag of stones and his unwavering belief in the ancestors' guidance, Amadi set off on a journey across the seas to the grand city of London, where the heir was said to reside. When Amadi arrived in London, the city was a world unlike any he had ever known. The streets buzzed with energy, filled with people from all walks of life, towering buildings, and a constant hum of activity. Despite the overwhelming atmosphere, Amadi stayed focused on his task. Guided by his stones, he wandered through the city, hoping the ancestors would lead him to the nobleman's heir. In a turn of fate, Amadi crossed paths with Edward Montgomery, a wealthy but disillusioned British aristocrat. Edward, an heir to a sprawling estate, had grown tired of his life of privilege and sought solace in the distractions of modern life. Unbeknownst to Edward, his family's history intertwined with the African village from which Amadi had come. To Amadi, there was no mistaking it, the stones pointed directly to Edward as the one foretold in the prophecy. Eager to bring Edward back to Africa, Amadi approached him in his usual cryptic and spiritual way, speaking in riddles about destiny and ancestry. Edward, used to polite company and predictable conversations, thought Amadi was a charming eccentric at first. However, after a series of encounters in which Amadi's stone readings seemed to oddly coincide with strange events in Edward's life, the aristocrat's curiosity was piqued. Edward agreed to meet with Amadi to hear more about his heritage. As the two began talking, Amadi told stories of the African village, its deep connection to the land, and the history that linked it to a European family generations ago. Though Edward was initially skeptical, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something real behind Amadi's cryptic messages. Over time, the bond between the two men grew. Edward found himself intrigued by the idea of leaving behind the pressures of his aristocratic life and reconnecting with something older and more meaningful. But the path was not without obstacles. As Edward weighed whether to travel to Africa with Amadi, the aristocratic world he came from began pulling him back. His family's estate was in financial trouble, and the pressure to secure his position within British society intensified. Amadi, unfamiliar with the intricacies of European social norms, often found himself in humorous situations. His spiritual practices, while deeply respected in his village, were seen as bizarre by London's upper class. Despite this, his sincerity and unwavering faith in the prophecy won Edward over bit by bit. At a formal ball, the tension between Edward's two worlds came to a head. Amadi, invited by Edward as his guest, performed one of his stone readings in front of the prestigious crowd. The spectacle created a stir, with some guests finding it amusing and others scandalized by what they saw as a breach of decorum. However, the reading had a profound effect on Edward, who began to see the truth behind Amadi's message. With his decision made, Edward set off for Africa with Amadi by his side, leaving behind the comforts and pressures of European aristocracy. The journey to the village was long and difficult, but as Edward and Amadi drew closer, a transformation began to take place in the Englishman. The modern, cynical man who had once been detached from his roots slowly started to open his heart to the possibilities of a deeper connection to the land and people of his ancestors. When they arrived at the African village, Edward was greeted with open arms. The village elders welcomed him as the long-lost descendant of a European traveler who had once helped forge an alliance between their people and his own. As Edward settled into the village, he realized that his destiny was not just about bridging two worlds, but about finding peace within himself. The village, a place of natural beauty and spiritual richness, offered Edward a stark contrast to the rigid expectations of his former life. Amadi introduced him to the ancient rituals of the village, from traditional dances to sacred ceremonies, all of which were meant to help Edward rediscover his roots. However, before Edward could fully embrace his newfound identity, he had to undergo a series of trials, each designed to test his connection to both African and European heritage. With Amadi as his guide, Edward faced each challenge, from learning to live simply to participating in spiritual rituals that connected him to the land. The final trial came when Edward was asked to lead a ceremony that symbolized the unity of two cultures, European and African. The village believed that only through Edward's leadership could this harmony be fully restored. Though nervous, Edward performed the ceremony, bringing together the wisdom he had learned from both his aristocratic upbringing and the spiritual lessons of the village. In the end, Edward succeeded in completing the ritual, earning the respect and admiration of the village. He had come to understand that his true heritage was not defined by his status or wealth, but by the connections he formed with people across cultures. Amadi, satisfied that the prophecy had been fulfilled, continued to serve as the village's spiritual guide, now with Edward by his side as both a friend and a leader. Edward chose to stay in the village, splitting his time between the two worlds that had shaped him. He used his resources to improve the lives of the villagers, while also helping to bridge the cultural gap between Africa and Europe. Through this journey, Edward had found not only his ancestral roots but also a sense of belonging that transcended borders.